The Lost Experiment of the Appalachians, when WWII created monsters on American soil. This is not just a title. This is a warning carved into the darkest corner of American history, where science, war, and isolation converge to create something unimaginable. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog clings to the valleys like a suffocating blanket and the trees stand as silent witnesses to forgotten sins, there existed a community that the world was never meant to know about. A place where the horrors of World War II did not end on foreign battlefields, but began anew on American soil, hidden from the eyes of a nation celebrating victory. It was the summer of 1947, 2 years after the war's end, when the first whispers began to surface. Local residents of Harlan County, Kentucky, spoke in hushed tones about strange sounds echoing from the abandoned mining settlement of Black Ridge Hollow, a place that had been officially closed since 1943. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Black Ridge Hollow had never truly been abandoned. It had simply been repurposed. The story begins with Dr. Edmund Kirschner, a German-American geneticist who had worked quietly for the US government during the war years. Born in Munich in 1898, Kirschner had fled Nazi Germany in 1936, bringing with him controversial research on human heredity and genetic isolation that had been deemed too extreme even by the standards of his homeland. The American military intelligence, desperate for any advantage in the race for scientific supremacy, welcomed him with open arms and sealed files. In the winter of 1942, as America mobilized its full industrial might, a secret directive was issued from Washington. Project Appalachian Genesis, as it was cryptically named in classified documents, was authorized under the pretense of studying the effects of environmental isolation on human physiology. The real purpose was far darker: to understand how genetic concentration could be weaponized, how bloodlines could be controlled, and what would happen when humanity's most fundamental taboo was systematically violated in the name of science. Black Ridge Hollow was chosen for its perfect isolation. Nestled in a valley accessible only by a single unpaved road that wound through treacherous mountain passes, the settlement had once housed 73 coal mining families. When the mines closed due to dangerous conditions in 1943, the government offered the residents generous relocation packages. Most accepted. Those who didn't were given a different kind of offer, one that came with cash payments, government rations, and a promise that their participation would serve their country. 22 families remained, 137 individuals in total, ranging from newborns to elderly grandparents. They were told they would be part of a study on mountain living and sustainable communities. They were told their sacrifice would help American soldiers. They were told many things. None of them were the truth. Dr. Kirschner arrived in April 1943, accompanied by a team of 6 researchers, 4 military physicians, and enough supplies to last years. The settlement's church was converted into a medical facility. The old company store became a laboratory, and the mine superintendent's house became Kirschner's personal residence and command center, where he meticulously documented every aspect of what he called the greatest human heredity experiment since the pharaohs. The methodology was brutally simple. The 22 families were reorganized into 4 distinct groups, each isolated from the others by physical barriers and strict scheduling. Kirschner's team controlled everything: food distribution, medical care, work assignments, and most importantly, reproduction. Using a combination of manipulation, coercion, and the family's desperate dependence on government resources, marriages were arranged between close relatives, brothers and sisters, cousins, and in cases that made even some of Kirschner's own team members resign in horror, parents and their own children. The first generation of children born under these conditions arrived in late 1943 and throughout 1944. Maria Holcomb was the first. Born on December 3, 1943, to siblings Thomas and Rebecca Holcomb, both 22 years old, the birth records, meticulously kept in Kirshner's leather-bound journals, noted that Maria appeared normal at birth, weighing 7 pounds, 4 ounces. But by her 6-month examination, the notations had changed. Developmental delays, unusual bone structure in the skull, eyes that didn't track movement properly. By 1945, 17 children had been born in Black Ridge Hollow. The records show that 12 exhibited what Kirshner coldly termed genetic manifestations of consanguineous origin. The language was clinical, designed to distance the researchers from the human suffering they were documenting. But the reality was impossible to hide behind scientific terminology. Young David Pritchard, born in March 1944 to first cousins who had been pressured into union, never learned to walk. His legs, according to medical notes, were malformed from birth, the bones twisted in ways that suggested his genetic code had been corrupted at its most fundamental level. His parents, Samuel and Martha Pritchard, both 26 years old, watched their only son drag himself across the dirt floors of their cabin, his cries echoing through the hollow. The community began to fracture under the weight of what was happening. In the summer of 1945, as the world celebrated VJ Day and the end of World War II, 3 families attempted to escape Black Ridge Hollow. They loaded their few possessions onto a wagon and tried to make it down the mountain road under cover of darkness. They were stopped by military police stationed at the valley entrance. The families were returned to the settlement. 2 weeks later, one of the fathers, Joseph Caldwell, aged 34, was found hanging in his barn. The official report called it distress from isolation. The truth was written in the note he left behind, discovered years later in declassified files. "What they make us do here is against God and nature. I cannot watch my children suffer anymore." But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Project Appalachian Genesis was not what it did to the children born into this nightmare, but what it did to their parents. Fathers who had been forced to sire children with their own daughters. Mothers who watched their babies born from unions with their brothers struggle for every breath. Grandparents who witnessed the systematic destruction of their family lines, all while being told it was for the greater good of their country. By late 1946, Kirshner's journals contained detailed medical examinations of 43 children. The rates of genetic disorders were staggering. Severe intellectual disabilities appeared in 67%, physical deformities in 54%, blindness or severe vision impairment in 31%. And these were only the children who survived past their first year. The infant mortality rate in Black Ridge Hollow during these years was 42%, nearly 10 times the national average. The government knew, reports were filed, inspections were conducted, and yet the experiment continued. In March 1947, a young nurse named Catherine Walsh, who had been assigned to the project fresh out of nursing school, managed to smuggle out a letter to her brother, a journalist with the Louisville Courier-Journal. In it, she described what she had witnessed: infants born with skulls that hadn't properly formed, children with organs visible through translucent skin, families driven to madness by what they had been forced to participate in. The letter never reached the newspaper. Catherine Walsh disappeared from Black Ridge Hollow in April 1947. The official record states she requested a transfer and returned to civilian life. No one who worked with her ever saw her again. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque as histórias que você está prestes to discover will change forever how you see American history, and you cannot afford to miss what comes next. By the spring of 1948, Black Ridge Hollow had become something that existed outside the bounds of humanity. It was a place where the natural order had been inverted, where the most sacred bonds of family had been weaponized, and where children entered the world bearing the visible marks of science's darkest curiosity. The second generation was worse, much worse. In Kirshner's journals, which would eventually be partially declassified in 1993 under intense congressional pressure, there are clinical photographs that even the most hardened researchers struggled to look at. Images of children whose faces seemed to fold in on themselves, whose limbs bent at impossible angles, whose eyes stared out from skulls that had grown in grotesque patterns. Each photograph was labeled with a number, a date, and a bloodline code that traced the exact relationship between the parents. Subject 47, born February 1948, was the product of 3 generations of brother-sister unions. The child, whose name was Sarah Ann Morrison, lived for only 14 months. Her medical file, over 200 pages long, documented a life of continuous suffering. Her spine curved in a severe S-shape from birth, creating pressure on organs that struggled to function. Her jaw had not formed completely, making feeding an agonizing process that took hours. And her eyes, according to the notes, showed a level of awareness that made the medical staff question whether she understood what was happening to her. Her mother, Elizabeth Morrison, was herself the product of a forced union between siblings. At just 19 years old, Elizabeth had already given birth to 2 children, both of whom had died before their first birthdays. The psychological evaluations conducted by the project's psychiatrist, Dr. Harold Wentworth, noted that Elizabeth had stopped speaking entirely by early 1948. She would sit for hours, staring at the mountains that encircled the hollow like prison walls, rocking back and forth in silence. But it was the case of the Patterson family that revealed the true depth of the horror that had been created in Blackridge Hollow. The Pattersons had been one of the largest families in the original group, with 11 members spanning 3 generations when the project began. By 1948, they had been systematically paired and repaired in combinations that defied every natural instinct. Jacob Patterson, the family patriarch, had watched his family tree collapse in on itself. His sons had been forced into unions with their sisters. His grandchildren were born from parents who shared not just common grandparents, but common parents. The genetic concentration was so severe that by the 3rd generation, the children being born to the Patterson family barely resembled human infants at all. In June 1948, a child was born to the Patterson family who Kirshner designated as Subject 62. The infant, a boy named Michael, represented what Kirshner called in his notes the logical endpoint of extreme consanguinity. The child's skull had not properly closed, leaving portions of the brain visible beneath translucent skin. His heart had formed outside his chest cavity, beating visibly through a thin membrane. He lived for 6 hours. The delivery had been witnessed by 3 military physicians who had come specifically to document this birth, as the genetic pedigree predicted extreme abnormalities. One of the physicians, Captain Robert Henshaw, wrote in his personal diary, later discovered by his family after his death in 1982, "I have served in field hospitals during the war. I have seen men torn apart by artillery and burned beyond recognition, but I have never seen anything that shook me as deeply as what I witnessed today. This is not science. This is the systematic creation of suffering. May God forgive us all." The mothers of Blackridge Hollow began to break under the cumulative trauma. In September 1948, 4 women were discovered in the old church building that had been converted into a medical facility. They had broken into the drug storage room and consumed a large quantity of sedatives. 3 survived after emergency intervention. 1, Anna Caldwell, aged 23, did not. Her body was buried in the settlement cemetery with a simple wooden cross. The official cause of death was listed as accidental overdose. But everyone in Blackridge Hollow knew the truth. Anna had been forced to bear 3 children by her own father. All 3 had died in infancy. She had chosen the only escape she could find. The children who did survive faced lives of unimaginable hardship. By 1948, there were 32 children in Blackridge Hollow between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. Of these, only 9 could walk unassisted. 12 were completely nonverbal. 17 required constant medical supervision to prevent seizures or respiratory failure. And yet, the experiment continued. Dr. Kirshner, now in his 50th year, had become increasingly detached from the human cost of his work. His journals from this period show a man obsessed with data collection, with proving his theories about genetic concentration and hereditary traits. He wrote extensively about blood purity, about the preservation of specific genetic lines, and about what he called the sacrifice required for scientific advancement. In October 1948, a new directive came from Washington. The project was to be expanded. 6 more families were to be brought into Blackridge Hollow, specifically chosen for their genetic isolation. The goal was to create control groups for comparison with the existing population. But something had changed in the Hollow. The families who had been trapped there for 5 years were no longer the compliant, desperate people they had been in 1943. They had watched too many children die. They had been forced to violate too many boundaries. And they had reached a breaking point. On the night of November 7th, 1948, as the first winter snow began to fall on the Appalachian peaks, a fire broke out in the laboratory building. The blaze consumed years of research, destroyed thousands of tissue samples, and reduced Kirshner's main research facility to ashes. The official investigation concluded that a kerosene heater had been accidentally knocked over. But several witnesses, their testimonies buried in classified files for decades, reported seeing multiple men carrying equipment from the building before the fire started. The destruction of the laboratory marked the beginning of the end for Project Appalachian Genesis, though it would take nearly a year for the government to officially acknowledge what everyone in Blackridge Hollow already knew. The experiment had failed. Not failed in its scientific objectives, perhaps, as Kirshner had accumulated mountains of data on genetic disorders and hereditary patterns, but failed in its fundamental premise that human beings could be treated as laboratory animals without consequence, that suffering could be quantified and justified in the name of knowledge. The winter of 1948-1949 transformed Blackridge Hollow from a scientific experiment into something far more sinister, a community of broken souls trapped in a nightmare with no foreseeable end. The snow fell heavy that season, cutting off the already limited access to the outside world and creating a sense of suffocating isolation that pushed the residents toward their breaking point. By January 1949, the population of Blackridge Hollow had grown to over 200 individuals, though calling them a population seemed almost absurd given the reality of their existence. They were prisoners, though they lived in their own homes. They were participants, though they had long since lost any real choice in the matter. And they were victims of a system that viewed their suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The children born in 1948 were reaching their first birthdays, and the survival rate remained devastatingly low. Of the 19 births recorded that year, only 7 children survived past 6 months. The others succumbed to organ failure, respiratory complications, seizures, or infections that their compromised immune systems couldn't fight. Each tiny grave in the cemetery represented not just a lost life, but a testament to the systematic violation of natural law. It was during this period that the psychological fractures within the community became impossible to ignore. Dr. Wentworth, the project psychiatrist, documented in his reports a phenomenon he called collective traumatic dissociation. Parents stopped naming their newborns, unable to bear the emotional attachment to children who would likely die within weeks. Siblings forced into unions stopped acknowledging their blood relationships, creating elaborate mental fictions to survive the psychological horror of what they were doing. And the children who were old enough to understand began to grasp the terrible truth of their existence. 10-year-old Thomas Holcomb, one of the first children born in the early days of the project, began asking questions that no one could answer. Why did he look so different from the children in the few magazines that made it into the hollow? Why couldn't he learn to read like his cousin Sarah, who came from one of the less genetically concentrated family lines? Why did his head hurt all the time? And why did the other children avoid looking at the way his jaw protruded at an unnatural angle? His mother, Rebecca Holcomb, the same woman who had been forced into union with her own brother years earlier, tried to shield him from the truth. But Thomas was perceptive beyond his years, perhaps as a compensation for his physical limitations. In March 1949, he confronted Dr. Kirshner directly during one of the regular medical examinations. "You did this to me," Thomas said, his words slightly slurred due to his malformed jaw. "You made me wrong." Kirshner's response, documented in his journal, was chilling in its clinical detachment. Subject 1 shows increasing awareness of his condition. Intelligence appears higher than predicted given genetic profile. Recommend monitoring for potential behavioral issues. But Thomas wasn't the only one who had begun to understand. Throughout the hollow, a subtle shift was occurring. The older children, those who remembered a time before the worst of the genetic damage became apparent, began to form a quiet bond of resistance. They couldn't change what had been done to them, but they could refuse to cooperate in their own continued exploitation. In April 1949, when Kirshner attempted to conduct a series of invasive neurological tests on a group of 8 children, they simply wouldn't comply. They sat in silence, refusing to respond to commands or participate in the examinations. Their parents, seeing this small act of defiance, did nothing to intervene. For the first time since the project began, the machinery of control had encountered organized resistance, however small. The spring of 1949 also brought the arrival of someone who would fundamentally change the trajectory of Black Ridge Hollow. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Sutherland, a military nurse who had been assigned to inspect the medical conditions of the project. Unlike previous inspectors who had come with predetermined conclusions designed to rubber stamp the continuation of the experiment, Sutherland arrived with no briefing and no preconceptions. What she found horrified her. In her official report, submitted in May 1949 and immediately classified, Sutherland documented conditions that she compared to the concentration camps she had helped liberate in Europe just 4 years earlier. Malnourished children with visible genetic deformities, parents showing signs of severe psychological trauma, medical care that focused solely on data collection rather than treatment or comfort, and an atmosphere of despair so thick it seemed to permeate the very air of the hollow. But it was one specific case that became the catalyst for everything that followed. In the Patterson family cabin, Sutherland discovered a 12-year-old girl named Emma, who had been confined to a small room for 3 years. Emma was the product of multiple generations of close consanguinity, and her physical and intellectual disabilities were severe. She couldn't walk or speak, and her spine had curved so dramatically that she was in constant pain. Sutherland asked why the child was being kept isolated. The answer, delivered matter-of-factly by one of the project physicians, was that Emma was contaminating the data set with her emotional outbursts, and her isolation was necessary to maintain the integrity of the research. That evening, Margaret Sutherland made a decision that would cost her her military career but save countless lives. She wrote a detailed letter to Senator Harlan Mitchell of Kentucky, a man known for his crusading stance on government accountability. In it, she described everything she had seen in Black Ridge Hollow, holding back none of the horrific details. She smuggled the letter out with a supply truck driver who owed her a favor, bypassing all official channels. The letter reached Senator Mitchell on June 2, 1949. At this moment, I want you to pause and think about something. Think about Emma, 12 years old, locked in a room, suffering for science. If you feel rage, if you feel sorrow, if you feel anything at all, I need you to do something for me. Comment right now. Emma deserved better. Just those 3 words, because acknowledging these victims, saying their names, remembering their suffering, is how we prevent history from repeating itself. Comment now. Emma deserved better. Within days of receiving Sutherland's letter, Senator Mitchell initiated a confidential inquiry. He contacted 3 other senators, all members of the Armed Services Committee, and shared what he had learned. By mid-June, a secret investigation had begun, though it would take months before any action was taken. The wheels of government bureaucracy turned slowly, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, in Black Ridge Hollow, the situation continued to deteriorate. The community had reached what psychologists would later term terminal cohesion failure. Trust had completely broken down. Families stopped cooperating with the medical staff. Several residents began refusing their government food rations, preferring to hunt and forage rather than accept anything from the project administrators. And the children kept being born. In June and July of 1949, 5 more infants entered the world in Black Ridge Hollow. 3 were stillborn. Of the 2 who survived birth, 1 died within 48 hours. The sole survivor, a girl named Mary Caldwell, would live for 18 years, never speaking, never walking, her existence a living testament to the cruelty that had been inflicted on an entire community. Dr. Kirshner, sensing that his grand experiment was collapsing, became increasingly erratic. His journals from this period show a man grasping desperately for meaning in data that had long since crossed the line from science into atrocity. He wrote obsessively about the need to continue, about how the sacrifices made couldn't be allowed to be in vain, about how future generations would understand the necessity of what had been done. But the future generations he imagined would have a very different interpretation of Project Appalachian genesis. August 1949 marked the beginning of the end for Black Ridge Hollow, though no one trapped within its boundaries could have known it at the time. The secret congressional investigation initiated by Senator Mitchell had been gathering evidence throughout the summer, interviewing former project staff who had resigned in protest, examining medical records that had been copied and smuggled out, and building a case that would eventually expose one of the darkest chapters in American scientific history. On August 12, 1949, a team of federal marshals, accompanied by military police and medical personnel from the Army Medical Corps, arrived at the entrance to Black Ridge Hollow. They carried orders signed by a federal judge authorizing the immediate suspension of all research activities and the evacuation of all residents for medical evaluation and treatment. Project Appalachian Genesis, after 6 years of operation, was officially terminated. But the reality of ending such an experiment was far more complicated than signing papers and issuing orders. The residents of Black Ridge Hollow had been so fundamentally transformed by their experience that the concept of rescue seemed almost meaningless. Where would they go? What would become of the children who required constant medical care? How could families torn apart by forced unions ever be made whole again? Dr. Kirshner was taken into federal custody immediately. He would spend the next 3 years under house arrest, while lawyers debated whether he could be prosecuted for crimes that had been authorized, albeit secretly, by government agencies. In the end, no charges were filed. Kirshner would die in 1956 of a heart attack, his research confiscated but never destroyed, his legacy a shadow that would haunt American scientific ethics for generations. The evacuation of Black Ridge Hollow took 2 weeks. Military trucks carried residents down the mountain road to a converted military hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, where a team of physicians worked around the clock to assess the physical and psychological damage. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Of the 87 children who had been born in Black Ridge Hollow during the project years and survived to be evacuated, 63 showed significant genetic disorders. 42 required ongoing medical care that would last the rest of their lives. 17 were non-verbal and would never develop speech, and all of them, every single child, bore psychological scars that no amount of therapy could fully heal. The adult residents fared little better. The psychological evaluations revealed depression rates of nearly 90%. Over half showed symptoms of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the terminology didn't exist in 1949. Multiple residents required psychiatric hospitalization. 3 committed self-harm within the first month after evacuation. But perhaps the most devastating discovery was what the genetic testing revealed about the long-term impact of the experiment. The physicians conducting the evaluations used blood typing and family history analysis, the most advanced tools available in 1949, to map the genetic relationships within the Black Ridge Hollow community. What they found was a population where the normal genetic diversity of human beings had been compressed into a horrifyingly narrow range. Brothers and sisters sharing identical blood types, children whose genetic markers indicated relationships so close that they should have been biologically impossible. Dr. Helen Forrester, the lead physician assigned to the Black Ridge Hollow survivors, wrote in her report, "We are not just treating genetic disorders here. We are treating the consequences of a systematic assault on human biology itself. These families have been transformed into something that exists outside the normal parameters of human variation. The children being born now will carry these effects for generations, and we have no way to predict what will emerge as they grow and potentially have children of their own." The question of what to do with the Black Ridge Hollow survivors became a matter of intense debate within government circles. The instinct was to scatter them, to place families in different locations across the country to prevent any possibility of continued interbreeding. But the survivors themselves resisted this. Despite everything they had endured, they had formed bonds forged in shared trauma. They understood each other in ways that outsiders never could. Separating them felt like another violation, another way of treating them as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. A compromise was reached. A new settlement was established in a rural area outside Lexington, far enough from Black Ridge Hollow to represent a new beginning, but isolated enough to provide the survivors with privacy and protection from the curiosity and judgment of the outside world. Medical facilities were built, special education programs were established for the children, and a permanent team of physicians and psychiatrists was assigned to provide ongoing care. But the damage could not be undone. The children born in Black Ridge Hollow would carry the marks of the experiment for their entire lives. As they grew into adolescence and adulthood, the effects became even more apparent. Growth abnormalities that worsened with age, seizure disorders that intensified, early onset dementia in individuals barely into their 20s, and in cases where survivors had children despite medical advice against it, the genetic damage was passed down, sometimes in even more severe forms. Thomas Holcomb, the boy who had confronted Dr. Kirshner about being made wrong, lived until 1967. He spent his adult life as an advocate for the Black Ridge Hollow survivors, speaking to medical students and researchers about the human cost of unethical experimentation. His testimony was instrumental in the development of new medical ethics guidelines in the 1960s, but he never escaped the physical consequences of his genetic heritage. He suffered from chronic pain, seizures, and progressive neurological deterioration. He was 33 years old when he died, looking like a man in his 60s. Emma Patterson, the girl Margaret Sutherland had found locked in a room, was moved to a specialized care facility where she lived until 1978. She never learned to speak or walk, but the staff who cared for her reported that she responded to music and seemed to find comfort in being held. When she died at 41, her case file was over 1,000 pages long, a comprehensive documentation of how a human life could be destroyed before it even truly began. The official government response to Project Appalachian Genesis came in 1952, when a carefully worded statement acknowledged that certain research activities conducted in the post-war period may have exceeded appropriate ethical boundaries and announced compensation payments to affected families. The statement did not admit wrongdoing. It did not name Dr. Kirshner or any other researchers. It did not provide details about what had actually occurred. And most critically, it did not acknowledge the full scope of the suffering that had been inflicted. The survivors received financial compensation that ranged from $5,000 to $20,000 per family, depending on the severity of the genetic damage to their children. For context, this was enough money to buy a modest house in 1952. It was not enough to undo 6 years of systematic torture. The story of Black Ridge Hollow did not end with the evacuation in 1949 or the government's tepid acknowledgement in 1952. It echoes through time, a dark reminder of what can happen when science operates without ethics, when human beings become data points, and when suffering is rationalized as necessary for the greater good. In the decades that followed, researchers studying the Black Ridge Hollow survivors documented effects that continued to manifest across generations. Children born to survivors in the 1950s and 1960s, even when their other parent came from outside the community, showed higher than normal rates of genetic disorders. The concentrated genetic damage had become so embedded in the survivor's DNA that it could not be fully diluted even by introducing new genetic material. By 1975, when the first comprehensive longitudinal study of the Black Ridge Hollow survivors was published in a medical journal under pseudonyms to protect privacy, the scientific community was forced to confront the full scope of what had been done. The study documented developmental delays, physical deformities, shortened lifespans, and psychological trauma across 2 full generations. The authors concluded that Project Appalachian Genesis had created what they termed a genetic bottleneck event in a human population, comparable in its severity to endangered species that had been reduced to dangerously small numbers. But numbers and statistics, however grim, cannot capture the human reality of what the Black Ridge Hollow survivors experienced. In 1981, the journalist Robert Mallory conducted a series of interviews with aging survivors as part of an investigation into government experimentation programs. The resulting article, published in The Atlantic, brought the story to public attention for the first time, though many details remained classified. One interview stood out. Sarah Morrison, who had been born in 1943 as one of the first children of the project and had miraculously survived despite severe health problems, spoke about her life with a clarity that belied the cognitive impairments she had been diagnosed with. "People ask me if I'm angry," she said, her speech slowed by neurological damage, but her meaning crystal clear. "Angry doesn't cover it. They took my childhood, they took my body, they took any chance I had at a normal life. And for what? So some doctor could write papers about what happens when you breed humans like livestock. I'm 68 years old, and I look 90. I've buried 3 siblings and 14 cousins. I've watched my own children struggle with health problems I gave them because of what was done to my parents. Anger is too small a word for what I feel. Sarah Morrison died in 1987, having outlived most of her fellow project survivors. She was buried in the Blackridge Hollow Memorial Cemetery, a place created in 1960 to honor those who had died as a result of the experiment. Over 300 graves occupy that cemetery, most of them children who never saw their 5th birthday. The partial declassification of Project Appalachian Genesis documents in 1993 revealed additional horrors that had been suspected but never confirmed. Kirchner's journals showed that the experiment had been conceived not just as medical research, but as part of a broader program exploring genetic manipulation for military purposes. The goal had been to understand how genetic traits could be concentrated and preserved, with applications ranging from creating soldiers with enhanced physical capabilities to understanding how enemy populations could be weakened through genetic warfare. The revelations sparked renewed calls for compensation and formal apologies to survivors and descendants. Congressional hearings were held. Medical ethicists testified about the violations of basic human dignity. And in 1995, President William Clinton issued a formal apology to the surviving members of the Blackridge Hollow community as part of a broader reckoning with unethical medical experimentation in American history. But apologies, however sincere, cannot undo the past. By 1995, only 11 original survivors of Project Appalachian Genesis were still alive. The children born in the hollow had become elderly men and women, their bodies worn out decades before their time, their families fractured by the legacy of trauma. Second and third generation descendants continued to grapple with health issues, psychological impacts, and the knowledge of how their families had been violated. In 2001, a memorial was erected in Harlan County, Kentucky, near the site of the original Blackridge Hollow settlement. The settlement itself had been demolished in 1956, but the memorial stands as a reminder. It lists the names of those who died as a direct result of the experiment, over 400 names carved into black granite. At the top, an inscription reads, "In memory of those who suffered, so science could learn the limits of suffering." May we never forget that the pursuit of knowledge must never come at the cost of human dignity. The medical legacy of Project Appalachian Genesis continues to be studied today, though always with the recognition that the knowledge gained came at an unconscionable price. Genetic research has confirmed what the survivors always knew, that extreme consanguinity creates compound effects across generations, that certain genetic damage cannot be repaired once it occurs, and that human beings are not laboratory animals to be bred and studied without consequence. Today, in 2024, 75 years after the evacuation of Blackridge Hollow, there are still descendants of the project survivors living with the physical and psychological consequences of what was done to their grandparents and great-grandparents. Support groups exist, medical monitoring continues, and the story, once hidden behind walls of government classification, has become a central case study in medical ethics education around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy of Blackridge Hollow is what it teaches us about the capacity for cruelty that exists when human beings are dehumanized, when suffering is abstracted into data, and when the ends are believed to justify any means. The researchers who conducted Project Appalachian Genesis were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were educated professionals, many with distinguished careers before and after their involvement in the project. They convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary, important, even patriotic. They were wrong, catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. The children of Blackridge Hollow deserved childhoods. They deserved families that were built on love rather than coercion. They deserved bodies that worked properly and minds that could develop fully. They deserved dignity, respect, and the basic human right to exist without being tortured in the name of science. They didn't get those things. And that is a stain on American history that no amount of time can wash away. If you made it to the end of this story, you've witnessed one of the darkest chapters in American scientific history. The survivors of Black Ridge Hollow never got justice in their lifetimes, but we can honor their memory by ensuring this story is never forgotten. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. These stories matter. These victims matter. And your subscription helps ensure their suffering is remembered and learned from. Leave a comment saying, "Emma deserved better," to acknowledge these victims. Every comment is a voice saying, "We remember, we care, and we will not let this be forgotten." If you watched until here, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit that like button if this story impacted you. Share it with someone who needs to understand the real cost of unethical science, because remembering is the first step toward preventing. The experiment ended in 1949. The suffering continues, and the only way we ensure it never happens again is by bearing witness to what happened in Black Ridge Hollow, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where WWII created monsters, not through warfare, but through the systematic violation of everything that makes us human.